Have you ever been at a loss for what to say to somebody who's suffering? Maybe they lost their job. Maybe they lost their spouse through divorce or even death. Maybe they just got a terrible diagnosis at the doctor's office. And you want to be able to say something to offer comfort. You want to be a helper. You want to be a good friend, a good neighbor. But you just don't know what to say. And you try to think something up, and then when it comes out of your mouth, you think, why did I say that? Well, that happens to a lot of us. And in the next few minutes, what I want to do together is talk with you about how it is we can be better comforters to the people who we know that are suffering. This is Tim Parrish for the Huntington Church of Christ, and I welcome you into this midweek discussion with us. Normally, at this time of the night, in the middle of the week, we're gathered here in this room to spend a little time discussing together some topic related to our spiritual walk. Over the last several weeks, we had been studying and discussing together the idea of faith in a world gone crazy. And we talked a lot about how to maintain our faith and how to hold on to a trust in God, even when everything around us is chaotic and crazy and pulling at us and causing us to doubt and to have fear and to struggle with anxiety. And all of that ultimately affects the way we think about God and what we do with that pain. So we've talked about how to maintain our faith and some things that we can hold on to kind of give us some stability. But throughout this study, one of the things that we've done is we've referred a number of times, kind of as a backdrop for this discussion, to the story of the biblical character of Job. Now, if you're joining us perhaps for the first time, I hope you at least have some level of familiarity with that biblical story. It's an account of a man named Job who is identified by God as a righteous man. And yet there is this conversation between God and the accuser. And the accuser says, yeah, sure, you think Job's a good guy, but we all know that Job only follows you faithfully because you're good to him. And if you stop being so good to him, if you take the hedge of protection down that you've put up around him, Job is not going to be the same guy. And thus ensues this strange test. Now, we don't like seeing behind the curtain in that story. It makes us a little bit uncomfortable. But the rest of what happens and what unfolds in that story is pretty remarkable. And it's the account of a man who loses everything. He loses his children. He loses his stable marriage. He loses his financial security. And really, in a sense, he loses his reputation. His friends come, and they spend a week with him being quiet, sitting in the ashes together. They are bringing him great comfort. And then he just lets it all out. In chapter 3 of Job, he laments. He goes through this really difficult to read statement of wishing he had never been born, of wishing he could undo even the day of his conception so that he wouldn't have to experience the terrible pain that he's going through. Now, maybe you've been on one or the other side of that particular feeling. Maybe you have felt like you were losing or did lose everything that defined your life, that meant something to you. Or maybe you know someone who has been on the losing side of those kinds of things and you wanted to help them. Either way, we don't want to end up like Job's friends, who in Job chapter 16, verse 2, he finally refers to as miserable comforters. Now, Job's friends held on to a theological framework that suggested that if bad things happen in your life, it was because of the punishment of God, that bad things didn't happen to good people, to borrow a sort of modern expression. That if these terrible things had happened in Job's life, it must surely be because Job was guilty of some really bad things himself. And if Job was guilty of really bad things himself, then surely that must mean that God was punishing him. And if Job would just get right with God, then all this trouble would go away. Except we know from the beginning of this book, Job chapter 1, we know that God is in fact not punishing Job, that Job is not receiving the penalty for his sin. That helps us a little bit. It also makes it a little harder for us to wrap our minds around this. But I want to kind of use what happens with those friends and how the one thing that they did that brought comfort to Job, I want us to see in that a pattern for how we can be less miserable comforters than sometimes we are. I spent a lot more time at the funeral home for my loved ones than I would care to have spent. And I promise you, I have heard some really dumb, really hurtful things. Now, people don't mean them to be dumb, and they don't mean them to be hurtful. In fact, they think they're being helpful because we have this idea that when we approach someone who's suffering, whether it's grief from death or whether it's a health issue or whatever might be going on, we think we need to speak wise words into that situation. We think we need to be helpful and say the right thing. And if we can just say the right thing, it'll help that person to feel better. And yet we are so terribly wrong in this. Because so often what we say from a good heart, what we say from a good place, ends up really being more hurtful and more damaging. And the last thing that we want to do is as representatives of God, as Christians, the last thing we want to do is step into a situation where someone is suffering and have them see us as a representative of God, making things worse. I see people in grief and suffering and pain and loss, if they are people who have a belief in God, if they have faith already, there are going to be enough challenges to that faith and to what God is doing and who and what God is without us adding to that by saying dumb things. So I want to suggest to you in the first place this evening that if we want to be good comforters, if we want to truly help someone who is suffering, the first thing we need to say is nothing at all. It's nothing at all. But boy, that is hard for us, isn't it? Maybe I should say it this way. That's hard for me. As someone who's now spent almost 30 years using my voice, using my words to communicate spiritual truth, it's really hard for me to communicate spiritual truth without my words. And yet I'm telling you, I've experienced it and I've tried this. And sometimes the very best thing we can offer to someone is silence. But you see, here's why that's hard for us too. Because we sometimes equate silence with doing nothing. And we think if I'm silent, I'm not helpful to these people at all. Except you see, when we use deliberate silence, when we choose to be quiet, we're not doing nothing. Because silence has a lot of features, a lot of layers that I think it's important for us to think about. Number one, silence is key when it's communicated with our presence. You see, if I'm just silent and I ignore you, well, that's one thing. But when I show up for you, when I step into your house, when I step into that waiting room, when I step into that funeral home, when I step into your living room, I'm saying to you, I'm here. I know you're hurting. I may not know your pain, but I'm here. And I'm not going to tell you to keep your chin up. And I'm not going to tell you that it'll just be a little while and then you'll get over it. I'm just going to be there with you. I'm going to let my presence speak for myself. Through the years, I have experienced the presence of other people. Because most of the time, when someone is there for you, you may not remember what they say, unless it was one of those really dumb things. I got a few of those filed back. But you will remember forever that they were there for you. Their presence really means something. One of my good friends wrote this, and here's what he said. Primary comfort for the bereaved does not come through the words of others, but through their presence. Their presence says they are willing to join you in your moment of grief and support you through it. The fact that they sent a card is more significant than anything they wrote in that card. Consequently, it is so important that comforters make every effort to spend time with sufferers from the earliest moments. The first rule of thumb is be there. But being quiet is so hard, isn't it? Even if we're there, being quiet is so hard because silence is awkward. You don't believe that? You just find yourself in a moment of conversation with somebody when you both kind of stop talking at the same time, and see how long either of you sit there before somebody says something to break the awkward silence. I'm terrible about this. In fact, I really worked as a teacher to get more comfortable when I ask questions of a class, of a group. To ask a question and just let it sit there and just embrace that awkward silence until somebody has something to say about it. It used to be I would ask a question, and if within just a couple of seconds, if somebody didn't say something, I would either answer my own question or I would try to do something else to prompt some answers. And sometimes the very best and deepest discussions have come when I just lay a question out there and just wait. The silence is awkward, sure it is. That's why we have trouble sometimes just sitting still in our own lives, because silence is awkward. And we worry that we've got to say the right thing to fill that silent space. I'm telling you. I've been preaching for years about the ministry of presence. It's a real ministry, and it's one of the very best things that we can do to not be miserable comforters. We just are there, and we are quiet. But I think there's a second layer to our silence. To be beneficial, to be helpful silence, there is a second layer to that silence. And that second layer is listening. I think that's one of the areas where Job's friends failed. For the first week, the Bible tells us that for a week, nobody said anything. They just sat there and they cried together and they grieved together and they just embraced the silence. They had that part right. They were there and they were quiet. But then when Job begins to speak and he begins to reach down inside the depths of him and put words to what he is feeling, when he expresses that he doesn't understand why God is doing what he's doing or where God is in all of this, when he says out loud, I really wish I had a lawyer who could help me take God to court because I need some answers. Well, they just couldn't hear that anymore. When Job said, this pain is so bad, I would be better off dead, because at least if I was dead, I wouldn't feel what I'm feeling right now. Well, that was hard for them to hear, because their theology didn't allow someone to say, I wish God would kill me off. Their theological worldview did not allow them to question what was going on, to question God and his motives and his actions. You see, what they heard, well, it illustrates that hearing sometimes is different than listening. I can hear what you say, but maybe I don't listen well enough to know what you're saying. Job was saying, I am hurting so badly. My heart has been ripped from me. I'm just grieving. I'm struggling. I'm hurting. This pain is awful. And they heard that. But instead, they heard someone who was being theologically disrespectful. They heard someone who was being, in their opinion, theologically dishonest, and they just couldn't stand by for it. They heard Job's words, but they didn't listen to what Job was saying. Furthermore, it wasn't just that they didn't listen, but when they heard his words, they accused him of not telling the truth. Job has never been more honest than he's being. When he says, look, I know this is not some sin punishment. I just don't know what's going on. I think God is doing this. God gave, God took away, but I don't know why. And I need to know. I need some answers. And you guys just don't understand. You haven't been where I am. You haven't walked this path. You don't know how intense and soul crushing my pain and suffering is right now. But they said, you shouldn't say that. You shouldn't ask those kind of questions of God. You shouldn't. Just tell the truth, okay? Let's just get right down to it. If you just tell the truth, if you just confess your sin, and they went from listening to scolding and correcting and preaching. Now, there was some truth in some of what they said. But even at the end of this account, God speaks to them quite harshly for misrepresenting him and who he was. So they thought they had all the answers, but they didn't. They thought their answers were helpful, but Job still didn't need answers. Maybe what he still needed in those moments of lament was somebody to just hear and listen to his lament, and to keep being there, and to keep sitting with him, and to keep silence. Because silence is about being present, but also silence is about listening. Now, I will tell you, sometimes listening to somebody's lament is hard. Sometimes listening to lament is hard, and it's hard not to take some of what they might say personally. And maybe someone who is grieving and lamenting might even lash out a little bit with their words. And if you're only hearing, then you're going to take that personally and you're going to get offended, and you're going to think you need to set that straight or set them straight. Whereas when you're listening, and yes, you hear the words, maybe even harsh words, maybe harsh words toward yourself, maybe words that sound awfully harsh toward God. If you listen, you can know that this is not coming from a place of unbelief, but from a place of belief. It's like C.S. Lewis saying, I'm not in danger of ceasing to believe in God, but I'm in danger of coming to believe such terrible things about him. You see, sometimes people are not rejecting their faith. It is precisely because of their faith that they're asking the questions and feeling the things that they are. And sometimes the thing that we've got to do is just listen, because listening gives people who are suffering permission to share their heart. And if somebody is willing to share their heart with you as you listen to them, then that allows you to step up underneath that burden and place it on your shoulder too. And now it's not quite as heavy for them anymore because you've shouldered up under it and you're carrying part of it. You're not trying to fix it. You can't fix it. I can't fix it. And that's tough on those of us that kind of think of ourselves as fixers. But instead, we listen and we let someone pour out their heart and we don't scold them. And if they get to a place where they need to just stop talking and be quiet, we just sit with them in the silence and we are quiet. And it's possible. It's possible. If we really open our ears and our hearts to listen as we sit presently and silent, we may well hear the expression of something that sufferer really needs, or at least really could use. Because you see, sometimes we do this thing where we ask people, and we mean it. I do it all the time. I don't mean it to be anything but an honest question. When I ask somebody, is there anything I can do for you? I talked to a friend of mine just yesterday on the telephone who's really sick right now. And I did that thing. I said, well, is there anything I can do for you? Anything I can bring you? Now, this friend is a close enough friend of mine that if there was something that I could do, we have an intimate enough friendship that they could have said to me, yes, actually, I need you to bring me this, or I need you to bring me that. I need you to do this for me. But a lot of times we're sitting with people who are suffering and the intimacy maybe hasn't been there between us. We are acquainted. Maybe we're even friends. Maybe we're Christian brothers and sisters. And yet there isn't a depth of relationship prior to this that will allow somebody to tell us exactly what they need. And so we listen. We listen in silence. And something they say might let us know, oh, they really need somebody to mow their yard. They really need somebody to change the oil in their car. They really need somebody to come in and clean the house and do the laundry and take out the trash. They really need this or that. And sometimes listening, they may not say those words, but they may be looking around saying, oh, this house is such a mess. I can't hardly take it anymore. There, if we're listening, there's our trigger. There's our clue to get up and start putting things away. If they'll let you, not without permission. Because you see, I think that's the third thing, the third piece of silence. We are present with people, we listen to them, and then when there are things that we can do, then we act. We act. Because sometimes action expresses love. Action expresses concern and sympathy and empathy. Action is the thing that says, I'm doing this for you because I care about you. It might be something that's unpleasant. It might be something I wouldn't normally have done for you, but I'm doing this for you because I heard you say it. And doing things for people that they may not ever even realize you did them. Now, in the South, we've been trained in at least one piece of doing when someone is suffering. We show up with food. That is just what we do. No one has to tell us that. Now, some churches like ours have food committees to make sure that meals get to people when they need them. But we don't need a committee to do that, at least not around here, right? When somebody is suffering, maybe somebody's been in the hospital. Maybe it's not even a bad suffering. Maybe someone's had a baby and they're back home, but things are not normal. And what do? We show up with food. Sometimes we overwhelm people with more food than they could possibly eat. I've learned through the years some better ways to maybe take a casserole to somebody that's not yet baked. And maybe when they want it, they can stick it in the oven. Or maybe take someone a gift certificate to a restaurant so that when they're ready for food from that place, it won't cost them anything to have that meal. Or maybe just show up in somebody's yard with a lawnmower and a rake and get things looking back in order. A friend of mine was talking the other day about somebody who, when she was really sick and had to spend several days inside, somebody came and weeded her flower beds. She still doesn't know who it was who did it. She doesn't even know how anybody realized that it needed to be done. But somebody did it. And even though it was anonymous, it communicated such love. We know these things to do. We know that if people will let us do them, and people typically are not going to ask us for these things, especially if it seems to them like something big. We've been trained also not to impose on other people. We've been trained to grieve by ourselves and pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. When in reality, when we're grieving, when we're hurting, when we're suffering, we can't do the normal things that we would do. And when someone else steps in and does those things. Now, some are equipped to do even more. You hear about somebody who loses their job, and you've been financially blessed. You're secure and you're doing okay. It may be that you're in a position to help pay their utilities, to keep their lights on, to keep the water on. Maybe you're in a position to contact the bank and say, hey, I'd really like to pay their mortgage for a couple of months till they get back on their feet. I'd like to take care of their car payment. And you call their insurance agent and say, I know in the middle of all this, they cannot afford to pay for their insurance, but they can't afford to not have their insurance. I'm gonna step up and pay. Now, sometimes people will resist this. So there's no doubt about it. And sometimes people may even act angry with you for doing it, for being presumptuous and stepping into something, because our pride is so big and our pride gets wounded so easily. But I'm telling you, actions express love, and actions lift burdens. Well, tonight's lesson has not been one chock full of Bible verses. It's not been one following the story of Job or the character of someone exactly. But it seemed like a really important thing to kind of come in here on the end of this study and spend a little time thinking about, what do I do and what do I say? And the answer to that, what do I say at first, is nothing. You focus on being there for people physically. Physically show up. If you can't, show up in a card. Show up with a text message. Show up with a phone call, if those things are appropriate. But especially if you can, even in the craziness of the COVID pandemic, show up and be present. And once you're there, just keep your mouth closed. Listen to what people are saying. Hear beyond the grief and the pain and the words that may sting our ears a little bit, and listen to someone's heart. And when you hear, through being present and listening, what someone needs, when you become aware of what you can do, then just do it. Act. And you still don't have to say, hey, I'm going to mow your yard today. You don't even have to say after it's over, hey, I did this for you. Sometimes it may even be better. I hear these stories all the time. I love when people share with me stories of people who've helped them when they didn't even know who was helping them. When people who've been able to stay in their house despite losing a job find out that someone else was responsible for that. I've been witness to that a number of times, and it's a beautiful thing. It's an amazing thing. And it requires no special words. It doesn't require you to say the right thing. Now, if you're able to be with us next Wednesday night, 1 week from tonight, I want to spend a little bit of time thinking with you about kind of the other side of this same coin. Because still we want to know, okay, so if all those things that I thought I should say are not things I should say, then what can I say to someone when I want to write a card? Or if I'm going to be face-to-face with somebody, is there something that I can offer that will be helpful and not hurtful? So I want to come back next week and spend just a few minutes, kind of like what we did this evening, talking about helping someone who is suffering by saying some right things. I hope you can be here for that. I'm so thankful that you joined us this evening. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next week.